G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series on chess stats, where I investigate some of the statistics behind the history of chess games and so on. Now today I'm doing a bit of a follow-up to an earlier video which I did, where I covered the rook endgame, 3 pawns for each side on one side of the board, and an extra pawn, outside pass pawn, an A pawn, a B pawn, C pawn, or H pawn. Just sort of worked out, what's the best way of handling that in terms of, how far the advanced pawns are and where to put your rook as a defender and an attacker. Now, today I'm moving on to another very, very common rook endgame. It's where it's a rook and a rook on each side, and then one side has an A and a C pawn, or an F and a H pawn. So basically a rook pawn and a bishop pawn, and generally considered a drawn position, but in real world situations, particularly at lower levels, not necessarily drawn. So we're just going to go through a couple of things today, just sort of outlining there what we're going to look at today. I'm going to be using, towards the end of the video, scoutfish to search for those positions, and once again it's a fairly standard thing. You put in a search query, king, rook, pawn, pawn, and king and rook, and then that gives you all those games, and then you've got to look at them a bit more closely, which ones are A and C pawn, all that sort of stuff, right? So you find the games, and then I want to first of all have a look at what actually happens in the real world environment. What should the winning percentage be? What was the winning percentage? So you get an idea of if you're transitioning that end game, for instance, should you do it or should you not do it? And then probably spin out a second video where obviously I found these games with these positions in it and finding errors by top players. It's good. Going through errors by top players is a really good way of understanding the right way of playing these end games. And so we'll get that on towards the end of the video, maybe next video. But what we'll do first is actually this. I found quite interesting. This is actually a good example of where there's some good theory to go over, so we know what we're looking at to start off with, right? So you can see there, the book I have been looking at is Survival Guide to Rook Endings. Quite funny if you look at this on Wikipedia. You can see the whole thing. It says roughly 1,400 to 2,000 plus. Another AI told me 1,400, 2,200. So basically perfect book for a strong club player. So that's good. And then if you go to the right section of this book, just let me load that up pretty quickly. Yeah, this section in that book. And you can see I've read this in the dim distant past, and the little tick next to the board means I've actually played over these positions on a real board, which, who does that nowadays? So offers the defender good practical chances. You can see what that says there. And what we're going to do is actually going to go through, I've coded up these positions in Skid versus PC. We're going to go through them all. A lot of really good ideas actually come out of it to understand what the attacking technique required by the stronger side is and what the defensive technique is required by the defender. So we'll go through these positions, some really interesting sort of tricks and stalemates and things, which are very useful to know. And you can see a couple of the compositions here by Balavenitz and Mazalis. Mazalis is quite famous. He's written some books with Averback, but Balavenitz also, I'm not familiar with him, but it's actually, he was a very strong player. Now, unfortunately, let's bring up a Wikipedia page. We go here. He was a very strong Russian player in Smolensk and had some very good results here in the Russian Championship. Before we finish that, I found he's actually in the USSR Chess Championship, Soviet Championship. He actually came third in 1939 behind Botvinnik and Kotov. So that's a pretty high standards. And a couple of years earlier, he came fifth. So he's up with the best players, there's Levenfish and so on. And so why haven't we heard of him? Well, unfortunately, he was fighting in the war in World War II and got killed. So he didn't, only aged 31. So, but obviously before he passed away, he's come up with these compositions we're now going to have a look at. Okay, so here is the Balavenitz position, and basically it is showing that this is a winning position, which either side is to play. Now you can see I've just outlined that if white is to play, he will win by playing h7 check and then playing f7, and black cannot stop the pawn from queening. This is obviously the worst position for black. Black king's cut off on the back rank, and the pawns both advanced to the 6th rank. So, and it is a win whoever is to move. But we can go through the line which they give for black's best defense. So check, king has to move. Best to go to the F file. Actually, part of one of the winning techniques is here to understand is to circle around to the E file. Check, E file, check. Now you can see that. You don't go to the 7th rank at this stage, so the threat of h7 check is still there. So basically, Don't go on the 7th rank until you have to. Now let's go rook d1 check is one of the lines given. So let's see what happens. Rook d1 check. Now you can advance because obviously now you're protecting the advance of your pawn to the 7th rank. Can't be allowed. So you've crossed over to the 8th rank, and then now's the opportunity to push pawn check. So the idea is, and this is where some of these tricks come in, right? F7, gotta love it. F7, rook takes F7, stalemate trick. Gotta remember that one. Okay. So the winning line is back king to E7, and then I get a check. Oh, so once again, it is another stalemate trick to look out for. In this position, rook takes F6 doesn't work because you check first and then you take the undefended rook. Gotta remember these. So next time I play this position, I'll be on the lookout for all these things. So you're going to go rook E1, check. King F8 fails. Let's have a look. Another stalemate trick. King F8. Now you do the Desperado rook and just check forever. So you got to go to F7, and then now, for instance, rook G1, check. Now we take the pawn, and you can see that we have got a winning Lucina position. Pawn's going to promote. Check doesn't help because we actually hide on H8. Okay, so we missed one line back here, king D6. We looked at the continuing checking. Another possibility is to pressure the pawn. So let's look at that. Rook H1. So what goes on here? H7 check. So there's two lines. If you take it, swaps off and it's a winning pawn endgame. Main line given king H8. What's the winning technique here? Check. Forced to push it, and that pawn's going through. You go king F8, blocking the F pawn. But the problem is that if you get cut off from the H pawn, then unfortunately the H pawn becomes the winning idea. Promote it, and we can do a skewer. I mean, there are other ways of winning, but I would do it with the skewer because now it's just going to be easier. King and rook win. Okay, so that was, go back to the start. We've covered this position. Winning for both sides. Very interesting. Keep an eye out for those stalemate tricks that you saw happen. Okay, so now let's move on to the next position, which is slightly improved for black, but black's king is still cut off on the back rank. So that actually gets back to being the major problem here. Once again, if you look at it, white will win by playing F6, and we'll go back to the previous position. So what can black do to defend this position? Okay, obviously got to check. And then we move our king to F6. And there are three defensive tries here. We'll go through each of them in turn. Go behind the H pawn, can go behind the F pawn, or can get as much checking distance as possible. Let's just do the, let's block the H pawn advance. Now, the previous tactic we saw won't work so well because white's king is not far enough advanced in this position. So here's the little technique you have to know. Check, and you can go to F8 or to H8. F8's the main line. Let's see what happens if you go into H8. And then this very tricky swing out with the rook. Swings out, check, and okay, there's not much to be done here. Black can't defend. This is just a winning position. Check. Pawn's going to promote. So that's what happens in this position if you go to H8. What about if we go to F8? Is it any more resilient? King G6, rook G1 check. This is quite sneaky. We're going to do it this way. Rook F1, now threatening to take the F pawn. I didn't cover it. If we just grab the pen, king comes back. Rook has to retreat. Probably there's best. Check. King gets forced out. You don't want to be mated. And then now this pawn's going to go through because the rook is covering the queening square. Okay, so that was after the check. King F6. We just looked at rook H1. So now let's do behind the F pawn. Rook F1. Once again, this check here is very good. Forces the king to make a decision. H8 considered best. Rook E7. Threatening mate. Could do something about that. Check. Made space for the king. Advancing the pawn. Check. Check. Cover. Advance. Check. In this position. H7 pawn just showed that one. That's just showing that so that's a draw. Rook F6 check. King advances. We take the F pawn with check, and if he doesn't, well, then we'll be taking the H pawn off. So it doesn't work. But what you do in this position is you don't play H7 like that, but you actually do this Very nasty check. So if the king takes the rook, then one of the pawns goes through. Let's just go through that line. I think you've got to take the rook. Otherwise get cut off on the F, on the H file. Check, check, check. Now we go in front. And that's winning. Right, so that's kind of good. And then we just did rook h1, rook b1. So let's see if maintaining checking distance saves you at all in this position. Rook e7, cover there. Get the king out of the way. Checks. King got a escape square. Hold the pawn. Come back. Check. And this is going to be a winning position because white's too far advanced. We've seen this setup before, even though the black king's on the short side. It's just no chance. Okay, so what we see there is that we go back to the start of that position. That's that position. Still winning for white, whoever has the first move. So let's go further back. Okay, what's the difference here? The black king is not trapped on the back rank. Now, if it was white to move, then we would check the black king back on the back rank and then we'll be winning. So once again, black's got to do something. Does nothing, he'll lose. So got to check. Let's see why this is different. King f6. I'm just following what Ems gave in Survival Guide to Rook Endings. It's kind of interesting. There's only one drawing move here, and that's Rook f1. Obviously, it stops any sort of flexibility. A few lines here. Rook e7 check, take the h pawn. Rook e5 takes the h pawn. Don't go through all the lines. I'll go through this quickly. Main line given is Rook e8. Can't take the h pawn because of mate. Now we take the checking distance, King f7. Now we take it. Doesn't really matter because now we've got the proper long side defense, and we're going to turn that into defense along the back rank, which is one of the other sort of standard defensive techniques. So this position can be defended, whereas the others couldn't, and then you go further back to this one. It's even easier, right? So I think there's a famous game with Smith-Stoff which has this position: Rook g1 check holds. Rook e1 holds, but the classic defense here is Rook to b5 with the pawns further back, so that you're kind of going to force f5. So let's see. When Rook g6 check is given, that's often a little sneaky maneuver. Now we press forward to the f pawn. Now we go back, and obviously going to have lots of fun checking from behind. King g5 is the main line. You could also advance the pawn check. Long side. It's like everything except the check. Go there, for instance. Block, check. Now this is different, and we can block white from advancing. There's no way to advance to the 7th rank. And if the white king is forced back, well, then we'll pick up the h. I just want to read what the summary of these positions by Ems in Survival Guide. As a conclusion to this endgame, it would be useful to recall John Spielman's summary, which he presented in the following concise way in Batsford Chess Endings. Now, I've got a lot of Spielman books. I don't have Batsford Chess Endings. I've seen many Batsford Chess Endings books. They're the famous ones on Rook endgames and Queen and Pawn and so on. Anyway, black usually loses if his king is cut off on the back rank. We saw that with the first couple of examples. He allows the enemy king to reach f7, so you've got to sort of stop that from happening. You can see this last example we got there. Get f7. He allows the h pawn to run with his king cut off on the f file. That's why it's important to think about where your king, where the black king hides. Often it's going to the h file. The correct drawing method is wait with the rook able to go to h8 until white advances his forces. As soon as white advances his men and thus unable to put his rook behind the h pawn, black should switch rook to a1 corner, which we had here. Rook will now be based on a1. Its function is to harry the white king, preventing it from establishing itself on dangerous squares such as g5. Check it from behind. Black king sits on g7 and answers rook g6 check with king f7 or king h7, the latter being simpler. And then you say, okay, point D. In order to make progress, white must either play f5. This is not dangerous with the black king on f7. If it was on h7, then black defends as in diagonal. Well, okay, and then h6. In this case, black king must go to h7, and he can defend as in diagonal above. That is the theory behind it. Okay, so now what I want to move on to is just quickly go into this idea of using scoutfish to find these endgames and to see what happened in these different positions in real world. Okay, I'll just go over this quickly. I'll just run something here. It's just on a smaller file. Don't worry about that. So What we need to do is use scoutfish to search for the material balance, king, rook, pawn, pawn versus king, rook, which is what we want. And obviously you need to search for the black and white side. Now what this done has, this database has got 104 games in it, but anyway, and it categorized it in terms of win, which should have been a win, 60, this is symmetrical, but 61 wins, which should have been wins, 52 draws, which should have been draws, and then these 7 and 10, look at them later on, are the games which were played incorrectly, i.e. it should have been a draw, was a win one side or the other, or should have been win and turned to a draw. So that's two combinations we look at. Now, when I run that on a proper database, it actually spits out a result file, just showing an example here. It's telling you who was the stronger side. In this case, it was white. Gives you the 2 pawns, which the stronger side had. And then it gives you what the result should have been and what the result was. So, for instance, this game, G2, H6 pawns, should have been a draw, and actually white won. Right, so that's a file. My main database comes out with about 60,000 games, which have this material balance. And from this text file, which is spat out, we can now have a look at, this kind of fits a bit big, but let's see how we're going. Okay, I think you can see everything, which is good. So I've taken all that data. There it is, and some few extra columns to help work out what I want to do. A and C is equivalent to F and H, for instance, right? So since we've got them all, A and D is the same as a E and a H, and so on and so forth. And you end up with pivot tables for what the result should have been, total number of games, and what the result was. So now we're going to quickly flick through this. So you can see, for instance, doubled 8 pawns. We had 400 games. The score should have been about 25%, 29% win rate. Presumably those cases where maybe the 8 pawns are winning because the defending king's too far away. You can imagine that. And the actual result was 139 games won. So actually 35% wins. So actually 6% more wins than should have been. And the one we're going to spend the most time on in perhaps the next video is this one, A and C. You can see that there were 6,468 games. The score should have been about 38% win rate, and the actual win rate was 54%. So if you have a look at this, there's a few games, a few setups which are the most easy to win. A and B pawn, okay, connected pawns are the best, but if there's a rook pawn, it's not as good as having connected B and C pawns, connected C and D pawns, or connected D and E pawns. They are the easiest king, rook, and 2 pawns versus a king, rook positions to win. But no real surprise there. Gives you a bit of the percentages, which are useful. And then, so A and C is not a particularly good setup. Should be 38% wins in practice. It's quite funny. In practice, though, it is the worst played endgame. You can see actually 54% of people win, which is 15% more than expected. What's the next worst played one? Double C pawns. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, not too many games in that case. And also very badly played is double D pawn. So actually, people defending against the double pawns making some systematic mistakes. And of course, we're interested in A and C split pawns. So it really is my recollection of I don't have a good idea of how to win or to lose these games, but if you're the attacking side, you just gradually move your pawns forward. And if the defender doesn't know how to defend, which I think is most of us, then you just end up winning because you work out some way of doing it, which is why I showed a bit of a sort of a theoretical defensive technique you should be using. Now, the other thing to think about is what about the structure of the how far advanced the pawns are, right? That's the second bit of it. Now, you've done it here. I've just highlighted these yellow columns, the ones which the attacking side has a pawn on the 7th rank. That's what these codes up here means, second rank, 7th rank, and then so you can see that the winning percentage, expected winning percentage, sort of goes up. I'm not going to say it's always the case. Obviously, it depends upon the sort of the breakdown of the pawns that you have in each of those individual scenarios. Because this number is quite high, but that's because quite a lot of them are A and B. Most of them are A and B, right? So obviously that affects the breakdown. But you can basically see that having a pawn on the 7th rank is generally helpful versus some other ones, 56%. And then when we go to A and C only pawns, then you can see that by and large, it gets back to think 40% of these games should be drawn. So there's a lot of drawn positions, and this obviously needs to be king cut on the back rank, and quite advanced pawn seems to be the only scenario which is should be really troublesome for the defending side. And then I said the actual is very high. It doesn't have much pattern. Just that people are able to win this endgame because the defensive techniques are not up to scratch. Right. Okay. So I think that's some pretty interesting numbers there. I'm going to do some charts and things on this, and maybe I'm going to do a video coming up, which will be looking more detail at the types of mistakes people are making. But what I'll definitely do is I think that this one has about 60,000 games. I've got another one where I filter it and I only take into account games by top players, and that'll probably make the players look much better because they'll know the correct defensive techniques. Yeah, that was quite interesting, quite useful little set of statistics, which I'm going to have to spend a little more time digging into. But I might leave it at that for today. So have a look at a little summary here. I basically just showed you a bit of the theory about how to defend these positions, how they should be played as a defender and attacker, and then we'll just had a first sort of brush on some of these statistics behind it. A little bit more data than I wanted today, so that's why we'll continue this later. Okay, hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.